I've had an interest in Indigenous employment for some time. I think when we look at the Closing the Gap outcomes that were reported on just the other week, one of the areas that's most disappointing is we're not closing that participation gap. The gap is very large, and we need to look at all of the ways in which we can improve that. One of the clearest ways is through public service focused training and employment. The public service as a whole adopted, in my view, a relatively weak target some time ago and hasn't made much progress to that target of about 2.5 or 2.6%. Defence needs to be part of that. Now, if you look at Western Australia, we've got some very significant Aboriginal communities, a significant Indigenous population, and that's one of the areas where Defence could both expand its presence in Western Australia, but also do it in that way that has collateral benefits. So I would love to see something like that. I know there would be a huge appetite for it. Well, first things first, people have to keep an open mind. So we can't have a situation where anyone, any decision maker in Defence or in government, just tries to push those kinds of proposals off the table or just rule them out as a first step. We need to entertain those kinds of ideas in the way that we do get a balance across this continent. There's no doubt that Western Australia's participation when it comes to some service areas, and Army is one of them, is subpar. So I think people need to keep an open mind and look at the potential to achieve that. No one should think that the sky is going to fall in. Nobody should say, oh, well, we can't do it because it's impractical to snap our fingers and move this from the eastern states to Western Australia overnight. What we do need to do is have a realistic appraisal of the status quo, then look at the potential to make that kind of rebalance and how that might occur. And I think the report puts forward some very reasonable suggestions about how that could be looked at and done in a measured way. The starting point is how we've begun to see our place in our region, and we've seen emerging and being more widely accepted this sort of idea of the Indo-Pacific, and part of that involves recognising that Australia does sit in two oceans, and that the tendency to look at the eastern side, the eastern seaboard, and the Pacific side rather than the Indian Ocean side does need to be rebalanced. There are enormous opportunities in the Indian Ocean, and Western Australia has to lead those opportunities, or the pursuit of those opportunities. At the same time, we have challenges, and we know that the Indian Navy is growing in its capability and its sort of interest in projecting into the Indian Ocean. Of course, we know that China has an interest in that, and we should be part of that, and we should be part of it in a constructive way. We need to look at issues of capacity, interoperability, all of those kinds of things. We need to make sure that we sort of deliver on Kim Beazley's idea of a proper two oceans perspective, which starts with a strategic understanding and then extends to the appropriate capacity building. You know, we can be and should be a power appropriate to our scale and appropriate to our sort of world standing. You know, we are not China, we are not India, we are not Indonesia, but we are a nation with a strong and well-earned reputation for conducting ourselves constructively as a country that depends on its position as an island, depends on the ability to navigate freely through our region. We are obviously a trade-dependent nation. We tend to forget in this era of air travel and the internet that the vast majority of everything that we import and export comes by sea. So we have a role to play in making sure that in our region, in the Indo-Pacific, that their trade routes are open, that people, other nations and ourselves conduct the way we relate economically and strategically in a sort of an open and rules-based manner. I think a lot of the focus around climate change is in the Pacific because of the preponderance of sort of small island nations, and now they are going to be affected most acutely by sea level rises and by other extreme weather events. But on the Indian Ocean side, it's not as if, I mean, if you go up into Indonesia and then you look around the sort of the Indian Ocean rim, there are similar issues. There are very low-lying areas. There are areas sort of dominated by delta features that are going to be affected, again, both by sea level rises and by extreme weather events. And it's really important that when people think of Australia's defence capability, part of what we use that capability for is humanitarian disaster relief. We've seen that a number of times in the last decade, and that is both the pure defence capability in terms of vessels and personnel, but also our merchant marine. And I have a concern. I've spoken before about the way that Australia's merchant marine capacity is at risk, and partly because of regulatory changes pursued by the current government. You know, we have fewer and fewer Australian flagged ships. We have fewer and fewer properly trained Australian seafarers. That does make our defence and our disaster relief capacity weaker than it should be, and it goes back to that point that I'd make, that you can never look at defence in isolation. Defence ties up and connects with many other aspects of our policy and our sovereign self-sufficiency. Well, I hope to play a constructive role in it. It's an area that I've been happy to speak out on. It's, I think, appropriate for my role as the representative of the Fremantle electorate. I know that there are people on both sides of the political fence from Western Australia who have an interest in seeing that happen. I will always be someone who works collaboratively and constructively to see that kind of change occur, and I think that it needs to occur strategically, but also as a matter of fairness in terms of Australian industry participation. I'm an optimist, and I believe that things that make sense will ultimately prevail, and I'll keep putting my shoulder to that wheel.